Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Alter4Cosplay and I'm going to show you how I made the Stygian blade from Hades. This is a fully 3D printed sword. I actually purchased the model. I'll leave a link down below for where you can buy it from too. And let's get started.
If you haven't heard of Hades before, it's a top-down roguelike. It's incredibly Roman inspired, super stunning art style. The weapons are amazing. I found this model on CG Trader. Thank you Gek564. I'm going to leave a link down below to his account, so if you want to make it too, you can go and buy it. All pieces were printed in PLA Plus. It's very similar to PLA, except it has an additive that makes it easier to sand. So these were all printed on my CR10S and then cleaned up with clippers, making sure things fit together before I started sanding. I only printed one eyeball. I found it easier to spend time cleaning up that one eye and creating a silicone mold to cast two. So I used Smooth-On's Mold Star 30, which is a 2-part silicone molding rubber. Mixed up some Smooth Cast 300, which is just another 2-part resin, and cast 2 eyeballs. Then using some pliers and some small snips, I started ripping out supports, trimming off brims, just generally cleaning up the prints before I started sanding. For sanding PLA Plus, I knew I was going to be using a spray filler primer, but I still went around with a pretty low grit sandpaper and also some files and cleaned up the really big chunks that were going to be an issue. Next up, I needed to glue the bottom and top halves of the skull together, so I used the rod that was going to become the handle, which would also perfectly align them, so while the epoxy cured, they would stay exactly where they needed to be. I then mixed up some 2-part 5-minute epoxy and just smeared that on both sides. Once that had completely cured, I grabbed some wood filler, so I use timber filler for my 3D prints. I find it's safe, easy to find, and sands reasonably well. I filled in the seam where I joined the 2 skulls, being super careful not to put too much in the eye sockets because I knew it would be hard to file out later. I then gave it another sand, making sure to focus on that seam. I would constantly stop, run your finger over the seam, see if you can still feel it, and then keep sanding. I grabbed a file just to make sure I could clean up all that extra filler that was in the eye sockets and started sanding the rest of the parts. I also brought out my downdraft box. It's a small box I made, has a vacuum attached to it, helps catch any of the dust that would otherwise go in the air. I put together the rest of the pieces using 5-minute epoxy. Before I use any kind of rattle can primer or spray paint, I always wear my mask properly over my nose. A few of the parts got a coat in filler primer that I buy from my local auto store. You'll notice a few of these parts actually have cups attached to them, so I hot glue little plastic shot cups to create stands, so I'm able to coat all sides and be able to put it down to dry. I then go back to sanding off the majority of that filler primer, just leaving behind the parts that will fill gaps. I then gave all of those parts a second coat in filler primer that I would eventually sand off again, and then wet sanded them with a 400 grit sandpaper. all of those pieces, then got a coat in regular primer to help paint stick, just in case I oversanded a little bit. For the eyeballs and the pommel, they were meant to replicate being a glowing green gem, so I started with a white base coat to make sure the green would really pop. I started with a bright lime green towards the tip, and then got darker as I got closer towards the end of the pommel. The skull base coat was an off-white, so it's a white with a drop of yellow ochre and a tiny little bit of brown, just to make it look more like bone and less bright white. I then went back in with brown and gradually add more shadows. I taped off everything except his eye holes and his nose hole and painted those black. And cleaned up the edges with a paintbrush. I find it much easier to hand brush curves as opposed to trying to mask them. I then also painted the inside of his mouth because I knew I wouldn't be able to reach it once it was put together. And I glued in his eyeballs. I then applied a nice layer of gloss coat to make it glassy. The wreaths, I started with another white base coat because the red needed to be really bright. This is called Ferrari Red from Vallejo Air. It was the perfect colour for this sword. I shaded each leaf with a bit of the red mixed with a little bit of brown. You never really want to shade with straight black. You always want to use just a slightly darker version of the colour that you're using. The next piece I worked on was the blade. The blade was cut into 3 pieces on the model. In hindsight, I probably should have put the rod through it to line these up. Instead, I just made do with 2 clamps and a husband. I went back in with the wood filler and filled in those seams. Time for more sanding. I then mixed up some more epoxy and started assembling just the skull. I also glued the skull onto the handle. For the handle wrap, I cut a strip of this fake leather that I actually bought in Chicago. I've used this leather on about 4 or 5 costumes now because I bought so much, and it was perfect for this handle wrap. I actually nailed the top of the strip into the handle, so I'm able to put a lot of tension on it. I then glue the pommel onto the end of the handle, hiding the end of that wrap. Then I got to work on the rest of the blade. I got a coat of filler primer, and I used XTC to basically fill the bottom of these glyphs so I didn't have to sand it. As long as you make sure it goes right to the tip of each glyph, it'll save you a few days of trying to sand that out with a file. I then painted some silver, and while I let that dry, I painted the smaller the details that will go on top of the blade. I I then started masking off that silver so I could do the red, making sure I get every single edge. I started with a darker shade of red for the inside of the blade. And then masked off an inner section so I could create a border with a lighter red. I then gave the blade a coat in clear gloss. I then began the incredibly long task of masking out these glyphs so I could paint them green. Once I had done painting those green, I then peeled off the masking tape, slid the blade into the skull of the hilt, and it was done.
Thank you so much for watching my video. If you want to see me keep making cool stuff, maybe you have a suggestion for what you think I should make or talk about things I've made in the past, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll see you in the next one.